Hi Year 10. Actually coming to you from the more familiar place of room 108 at school today. Just popped into school to do some work and to try and get some things done, so actually I'm recording at school. So today we are doing the second to last part of the Cold War, which is exciting. So you're nearly there. You've nearly finished. If you kept up with us, you've now finished the whole course. If you feel like you're slightly behind, it is coming to an end next week, so you can hopefully start to catch up. Again, please get in touch with your teacher if you're struggling to do that, okay? We are really happy to send you a list of the things that you have missed because we've been tracking what you've been doing, or to give you some help and some advice. So please do send an email to me or your class teacher if you're struggling, okay? We are going to try and call some of you across the week as well. So today so last week you did détente, which was a period of relaxation, when things calmed down, when things got better between the USA and the USSR. And actually today we're doing a period that is sometimes known as the Second Cold War. And this was a period of higher tension and worsening relations again, that went from 1979 to 1984, roughly, okay? So the 1970s was that relaxation détente period, and at the end of the 1970s, so in 1979, that came to an end, okay, and things got worse again, okay? So we're going to start with, if those of you that are really good at making notes, and I know some of you have been doing that really well, the causes of the Second Cold War. Why did it happen? Why was there a Second Cold War? So interestingly, and quite sadly in some ways, in 1979, the Soviet Union, so the USSR, actually invaded Afghanistan, okay? Now, Afghanistan had had a communist government since 1978, since the year before, and they worked quite closely, interestingly, with the Soviet Union. So the USSR had lots of influence in Afghanistan. Now, communism isn't something that really works very well with a particularly religious country like Afghanistan, and many of the Afghani people didn't like this communist influence in their country. In 1979, the Soviet-backed leader was assassinated. He was actually assassinated by someone in his own party, but at the same time, there was a resistance group called the Mujahideen, who had formed and were trying to resist this communist government in Afghanistan, okay? And then unfortunately, then the Soviet leader was then assassinated. He was replaced with another communist leader, but who wasn't as strong or wasn't as well liked. And the Soviets really feared losing influence in Afghanistan. So on the 25th of December 1979, it's a good date to remember because it's Christmas Day, 50,000 USSR troops invaded Afghanistan in order to support this communist government, okay? And that really angered the USA. It was the Soviet Union breaking that Helsinki conference, getting involved in the affairs of another country, and it caused this big increase in tension, this what's sometimes called the Second Cold War, once again, okay? Now, the second reason that sort of worsened this period of increased tension was actually, you may have heard of him, and you probably, if you watch American sitcoms like maybe Modern Family, or if you've watched that 70s show, you will definitely have heard of Ronald Reagan. And he took power in 1981. Okay, and he was very anti-communist and anti-USSR when he first came to power. Okay, so in 1981, at first, he had no interest in détente, in working with the USSR. He gave a very famous speech where he called the USSR the evil empire. And this was actually at the time when the first Star Wars film came out. So there are some cartoons of the time as like Ronald Reagan dressed as Obi-Wan Kenobi as the hero, and the USSR dressed as like Darth Vader. So he called them really famously the evil empire, which is quite an insult. And he decided to increase money on arms spending and pumped lots of money into new technology, which again fed into this period of increased tension and worsened relations. Okay, so he's one of the causes. I know that actually he comes into power 2 years in, but he's one of the reasons that things get worse. So I'm now going to talk about what were the key events of that second Cold War when tensions increase again, what actually happened 1979 to 85 that show that relations between the USA and the USSR had got worse. Okay, it is quite a lengthy video this week. Hopefully you're keeping up with me. First of all, you have the Carter Doctrine. So before Reagan was Carter, and he was actually in power so this was the USA's response to the USSR's invasion of Afghanistan. This is the third and final doctrine as part of your Cold War course. Remember, you've done the Truman Doctrine, you should have done the Brezhnev Doctrine, and this is the Carter Doctrine, so a USA doctrine. And he said in his doctrine, in his speech, that the USA will use force if the Soviets try to take over the Persian Gulf, which is that area around the Persian Sea where Afghanistan is and other countries, and the USA were obviously particularly interested in that because they were quite wealthy areas with lots of access to oil. Okay, so he said if the Soviets tried to take over in that area, the USA will use force. Okay, he also put in place economic sanctions, so the USA was no longer selling grain to the USSR, and they were not buying oil from the USSR. Okay, so that ends. And actually, interestingly, so the USA started to provide secret assistance to the Mujahideen, who were the group that were against the communist government in Afghanistan. Actually, they became later some of the kind of extremist Muslim groups from Afghanistan, and the USA were providing them with weapons and assistance, which is quite interesting in terms of world history. And obviously this is another example of further confrontation, tensions increasing, the Second Cold War. Another thing that happened, and I think this is exactly like two children in a playground, so they boycotted, which hopefully you remember that word from when you did the civil rights and the bus boycotts. So it's when if you boycott something, you refuse to do it. So in 1980, Moscow, also the USSR, were due to hold the Olympics. And the USA and 60 other nations decided not to go. They boycotted the Olympics. It's a little bit like, we don't like you anymore, we're not going to your party. Okay, we're not going to go to your birthday party. And then in 1984, when the Olympics were interestingly in the USA in Los Angeles, the USSR said, well, you didn't come to my party, so I'm not going to yours. And so the USSR and 15 other Warsaw Pact countries did not go to the Olympics in LA, okay? So another two key events that show that they're not, this period of détente, of relaxation, of better relationships has worsened again. Things have got worse again. Also in 1980, the USA refuses to ratify, which is a fancy word for sign, SALT II. So they don't sign that final agreement that was going to be part of détente. And you've got the arms race starts again. So both sides don't really like each other. They are creating weapons again. And you get increased spending on weapons. And interestingly, one of the key events of the Second Cold War is in 1983, Reagan launched a program called SDI, which stands for Strategic Defense Initiative. But it was nicknamed the Star Wars Project because it was so mad, okay? It sounded like something out of Star Wars. So what Reagan was planning to do was spend loads of money to put satellites into space that would use a complicated system of lasers and mirrors to be able to shoot missiles out of the air. So if the USSR launched a missile towards the USA, this would be their protective system, okay, that would be able to knock the weapon out of space. Now, this actually, unsurprisingly, never actually came true and was never made, but it did have the impact of making the USSR feel almost completely powerless. You know, if the USA can knock their missiles out the air, then they are no longer competing as a superpower. And this kind of Cold War, can they even fight it anymore? So this is what's quite interesting, is the USA certainly comes out as maybe able to do much more in this Second Cold War and is much more powerful than the USSR.
Hi, this is staff announcement. It's 15 minutes notice for everyone. School will be closed in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Do you remember that? School closing in 15 minutes, so I need to hurry up a little bit. Okay, so the consequences of this second Cold War. What was the impact of all this? Well, you've got a period of poor relations and increasing tension, okay, between the USA and the USSR. You've got the end of détente, that period in the 1970s when everyone thought maybe the Cold War might come to an end. It's restarted again. You get another arms race, although it doesn't last very long, but you get another push for creating nuclear weapons from both sides, but particularly the USA with things like the SDI or their Star Wars project. And interestingly, the USSR are then really, really struggling, okay? So because their economy is struggling, the people are within the USSR and the satellite states, so the other communist countries, have really poor living standards. There are protests, particularly in Poland. Also during this period, Brezhnev dies and there are 3 different Soviet leaders. You don't need to know their names, but they were all over 70. They all died really suddenly, so just of old age, I think. So you get very unstable leadership in the USSR until a man called Gorbachev comes in 1985. And actually it's Gorbachev and Reagan that realise that that work together to bring the Cold War to an end. And that's what I'm going to do with you next week. So we're doing the end of the Cold War next week. So we've just done the little kind of increase in tensions again when things get worse, okay? And now we're going to head into the end of the Cold War when things improve and we get an end to everything. I'm just going to really quickly give you the pages of the revision guide where this is on, because it is not in a really clear order. So if you want the stuff about the invasion of Afghanistan, it's on page, I'm covering it, 24 and 25. And then really Reagan and the Second Cold War and his influence and the increase in the arms race again is on page 26. So page 24, 25 and 26 is where you should have a look at if you want to get some more information, if you've got a revision guide. If you don't, I'll put the BBC bite-size links, which are just as good, and you can also use Seneca to study that as well. Okay, hope everyone has a good week. Have a go at the quiz, take care, and see you next week. Bye, Year 10.